Утро начинается с рассвета. Здравствуй.
A dangerous gamble or an attempt to save the economy, a cover operation or an effort to fight post-war famine, the issue of food or of national security. For over half a century, the topic continues to baffle, overwhelm and invoke pride. The unplowed fields of mysteries, Tselinograd. The Virgin Lands campaign in Kazakhstan. That was how that year began. The unforgettable 1954, the year of great work, fame and achievements. Komsomol is on its way, the banners and the trains. Take a book with you to read on the train. It's the most thorough baggage. In every train car, and most of them were freight cars, one could hear these life-affirming words. A morning starts at dawn. Hello, boundless country. Students have their own planet, planet Tselinograd. Chapter 1. The cover operation. Everything was exactly as the song had promised. The first groups of Tselinograd workers were met with heat, wind and cold. Winter temperatures would drop as low as 50 degrees below zero, but the steppe would bloom again because the party issued a task and the Komsomol was keen to deliver. All radios in the country were blasting out the same message: we are to step into the future with bravery, and even though the path before us is filled with hardship, it is in our power to achieve happiness, lasting happiness for centuries to come. Everything was indeed in their power, but first, as it often happens, a decision was to be made. In late February, the plenum of the Communist Party convened on further increase of grain production. By May 1954, more than 130 people had been sent to toil in the fields of Kazakhstan. His parents were also among the first wave Tselinograd workers, says historian Alexander Shubin. When the first group of people was deployed, they essentially found themselves in the wild steppe with no infrastructure whatsoever. At first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary. That was the Communist Party's usual method of implementing nearly all of the large-scale plans. But according to one version, the heavily advertised battle for crop yields was nothing but a cover operation designed to divert attention from the construction of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The attempt at masking the project proved successful. The world buzzed with the news for a while and got bored of it quickly. There were more feats to come, and come they did. People continued to arrive at the final destination, often finding to be nothing but a peg in the middle of the steppe. It took great effort to get there. In the absence of roads, it could take as long as a couple of days to cover a distance of 200 kilometers. People had no choice but create their own housing accommodations in the empty surface. Those in charge could bring new people to the steppe and say to them, put a peg in the ground over there and build a new kolkhoz called the Way of Ilyich. At more than 600,000 square kilometers, the area was larger than France. The Virgin Land attracted mostly young people. Born and brought up with the ideology of the followers of Panfilov, Teluskin and Chapayev, this was a sincere and devoted generation, the product of their era and ideology, the Soviet Komsomol. Trains filled with young people continued to arrive. The Young Communist League, ready to provide the cheap labor. Easily and most importantly unnoticeably to the Western security services, the steady stream of Tselinograd romantics started to include trains filled with missile technology, scientists and the military personnel. As far as they were concerned, they were there to help conquer the Virgin Lands. It seems to me that the epic Virgin Lands campaign was played out so skillfully on Kazakhstan soil. It was done by the hand of the talented puppeteer that was the Soviet government. The Tselinograd epic is one of the golden pages in the history of our land. The oldest local history museum in Kazakhstan, the Kostanay Local History Museum, opened in 1915. A large part of its wealth is dedicated to the Virgin Lands campaign. They brought with them the most important things. Here, take a look: traveling bags and suitcases. The first tents, unusual street and tent campuses began to appear in the steppe. Here it is, the vast Tselinograd steppe. When observed from the reconnaissance flight, these growing islands of life in the middle of the desert looked very similar. Later, the new steppe dwellers began to build houses. Depending on the region, construction materials ranged from adobe to reed and aspen poles. In general, people settled as well as they could manage. For example, in the future capital of the Virgin Lands, then known as Akmolinsk, students were housed in the old pre-revolutionary train cars. It didn't matter whether you had enough clothes or food, what the living conditions were like, or whether you had a good tent or a torn one. No one ever asked these questions. And while some of them were busy sowing grain, others constructed rockets. The most important thing remained hidden in plain sight, according to some researchers. If you come up with an extra 1 million tons of grain, you will be able to afford the Baikonur and everything associated with it, nuclear power and the construction program. If you don't, all you will get is hunger. Was the former inseparable from the latter or just concealing it? Historians still argue which first came, the Baikonur or the Tselinograd. Chapter 2. The bread issue. Ten years later, the Soviet Union had yet to recover from the disastrous legacy of the Great Patriotic War. Grain production failed to reach the level of 1940. The country was again on the verge of starvation. But was the idea to nourish the homeland with Tselinograd bread a success, or did the heroic labor prove essentially fruitless? Instead of the proposed 13 million hectares, 43 were plowed. Field workers got up at the crack of dawn and went to bed late at night. Lunch was served in the field kitchen. Work payday equaled 1 ruble and 80 kopecks. Harvesting had to be completed within a short period of time, otherwise the grain would crumble and become buried under the snow. We were working ourselves to the ground. We were so tight that we had no energy left to wash up at the end of the day. We worked around the clock with the headlights on, and we lived by the motto, we must, we must, we must. If we can't do it, then who can? I witnessed 2 of the most monstrous Tselinograd years when almost the entire crop was ruined. Actor and Alma-Ata native Lev Prigунov found himself in the Virgin Lands immediately after enrolling in the Pedagogical Institute. They carted hay, built baths, hostels and prepared soil when the time came to remove the turf. There was no storage place to keep the grain. In 1956, Kazakhstan gave its first billion. The Republic was awarded the Order of Lenin and the country with bread, but only on paper. No storage space of any kind had been prepared. There were no roads or even sheds to store the grain. Millions of tons of grain were left to rot, only to be burned later. The roads were 500 to 600 meters wide. They weren't even roads at all. It was just this wide open space, which was covered knee-deep in grain. We took it to Stepnyak, which was 300 kilometers away. And there was this much grain left at the bottom because everything was thrown out at that time. Commonplace Soviet reality. After the battle for the harvest begins the battle with the harvest. Part of the crops was of course preserved, and for some time 1/3 or even half of the grain produced in the country, and it was high-quality grain, came from the Virgin Lands. Nevertheless, in 1961 the Soviet Union began purchasing wheat in America. The response to the question whether or not the Tselinograd project succeeded in feeding the country is a definite no. Everyone talks about the pros and cons. The turf pulled off by the plows no longer protected the soil from the wind, which led to dust storms and reduced crop production significantly. The Tselinograd campaign became a blow to yet another industry, animal breeding. Banished to salt flats, the animal farms could flourish no more. Tselinograd was a crushing blow to meat and dairy production in Kazakhstan. This is a well-known fact. Despite the first year's barbaric development methods and a rapid decrease in crop yields, it happened exactly as Khrushchev intended. If the Virgin Lands campaign hadn't been carried out, the industrial spurt would never have happened, and it would have been impossible for the Soviet Union to compete with the United States in the arms race, which in turn would have manifested in a very realistic threat of nuclear destruction of our country. It must buy us some time. Not only do we need to get as much bread as possible, but we must also accomplish it in as little time as possible. Needless to say, when something is being done in a rush, mistakes are unavoidable. Nikita Sergeyevich was mostly concerned with the time limitations. However, he had some other ideas as well. Chapter 3. The Virgin Lands Republic. Tselinograd instead of Moscow. A new capital in the center of Eurasia, another grand adventure or a realistic plan. According to one version, Khrushchev intended to move the capital of the Soviet Union. Excerpt from a speech by Nikita Sergeyevich, borders between the Soviet republics will disappear and a new capital will be founded in Akmolinsk. Thrice reborn, a provincial town filled with one-story houses, 3 factories, 5 schools and 7,000 residents, this is Akmolinsk before the revolution. Then, in the middle of the last century, Tselinograd, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and the center of the region, home to 100,000 residents. And today, a large metropolis with 1 million inhabitants and the futuristic architectural marvel of Kazakhstan, Astana. In the 1960s, the city could not even dream of acquiring the metropolitan glamour that awaited the city in the future. Needless to say, the notion of Akmolinsk replacing Moscow as the capital of the Soviet Union was simply surreal. However, Khrushchev's plan was far more realistic. The Tselina land could become the 16th Republic of the USSR. And why shouldn't it? It had been given all the best technological and human resources available, received a great budget ranging between 18 and 25 billion rubles. Its geographical location was highly advantageous. Planet Tselina, multinational, multilingual, young and promising. In 1961, the city was granted the status of the Tselina land. It included Akmola region, Tselinograd region, all of the Kokhchetav regions, Karaganda region and the whole area of the Virgin Lands. In a matter of several years, the overpopulated and dusty Akmolinsk turned into a green and quite comfortable oasis in the middle of the desert. Small adobe houses, narrow streets, 80,000 inhabitants. And now, the city of Tselinograd is home to 3 times the initial number of people. It has been fully renovated and reconstructed. It boasts dozens of industrial enterprises, 4 universities, 15 colleges which have trained more than 20,000 specialists in the last 3 years. Praise be the hand smelling of bread, said the poster at the entrance. Tractor K700 named Amanjol Restaurant, the Golden Field, Tselinnik Avenue, Tselinnik Project and Tselinnik Palace, it all happened in record time. And how could it not? The calling card of the Republic's capital had been erected. In the early 1950s, there was a movie theatre called Homeland here, on this very spot. And in 1961, when Nikita Khrushchev was due to arrive in the city, it turned out that there weren't any capacious premises to accommodate the scheduled Tselina Congress in all of Tselinograd. The event was held in one of the territory of one of city's industrial zones. The situation was rectified quickly. It only took 2 years, and it was rectified at the scale and scope unheard of before. By the autumn of 1963, the place was already suitable for conducting Communist Party congresses. There were 10 projectors installed in the projection room. The botanical garden overflowed with exotic plants, and the capacity of the Congress Hall reached 2,335 seats. With such scale and equipment system, the Tselinnik Palace was considered second only to the Kremlin Palace of Congresses in Moscow. However, the idea was never carried beyond the creation of the 16th Republic. Alma-Ata was vehemently opposed. The main law of the country stated that the boundaries of the republics were indivisible. The constitution helped tremendously. Besides, by that time, Khrushchev's authority was no longer as all-encompassing as it had been before. Moscow was never moved from its initial place and the new republic was never formed. Despite all this, it is evident that the head of the Soviet Union held Tselinograd in high regard. The first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, has visited the Tselina land in Kazakhstan. The city would subsequently lose its status of the Tselina capital with Nikita Sergeyevich's removal from power, but it would become a capital nonetheless. Despite the many drawbacks, Tselina remains an important milestone in history. Almost 4 billion tons of grain had been harvested in over half a century. And it still works today. The unplowed fields of mysteries, Tselina.